Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's tutorial. Today we want to look at the pelvis. Remember that when you look at the cavity, the pelvic cavity, it is sort of continuous, superiorly with the abdomen. Therefore, we tend to use the word, the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, inferiorly, you are going to have the perineum. That's the region in between our thighs, where we have, the external genitalia. Then, of course, in addition, we're also going to have, the anal canal. Remember that this pelvic cavity will actually be separated from the perineum by what you call pelvic diaphragm, which we'll get to see. Now, remember that this cavity, is going to have, most of, you are going to have, the urinary bladder in there. You're also going to have, important organs such as, the uterus will be there. Yes, apart from that, some portion of, the anal canal will also be there. Actually, the rectum will be there. Yes, together with, of course, the inferior portion, something like the sigmoid, colon will be present there in the pelvis. Now, today we are interested in actually knowing the wall of this pelvis. We're already seeing, the osteology regarding, the bones, which are going to contribute to the formation of, the pelvis. Now today we want to look at the myology. So without much ado, we begin our journey with the myology of the pelvis. So this is the pelvis, and as you can see, you have two halves, a right one and of course the left one. Now we got to know that, yes, of course, we had some important bony landmarks, which of course we want to show. We saw, of course, that actually, yes, there's the lumbar, the last lumbar vertebra, as you can see. Yes, it will be connected to the ilium, by way of, the, iliolumbar ligament. So the anterior and of course posterior iliolumbar ligament, which are not clearly shown here, which is going to help actually stabilize, the pelvis. Yes, we also saw that by way of synovial joints connecting, the sacrum to, the ala of the sacrum to what we call the, ala of, ilium. We saw that one. That of course, we are going to have what we call the plain synovial joint actually, so that to help, stabilize the joint, to permit some slight, movement. It's actually amphiarthrotic. Now, that's by way of, the sacroiliac joint. Now, importantly, we also got to know that there was a bony landmark actually related to the ischium, which we called it, the ischial spine. And we said that this ischial spine in the living will be transformed into foramina. So this area is the greater sciatic foramen, and this area is the lesser sciatic foramen. Now these foramina are actually transformed by way of these ligaments, and one of these ligaments is known as, from the sacrum, as well as, the coccyx, all the way to this ischial tuberosity, and therefore we call it sacrotuberous ligament. And deep to this sacrotuberous ligament, actually also coming from the coccyx, as well as, the sacrum, all the way to what we call the ischial spine. Then we are going to call it sacrospinous ligament. So these two ligaments, sacrotuberous ligament and sacrospinous ligament, are going to transform this, greater sciatic notch and lesser sciatic notch into respective foramina. Now, one other thing that we have to appreciate, will be that when we turn the bone internally, we also seeing those bones by way of orientation. We are going to have this the body, actually this is the area of the pubis. Then of course, this is going to be the pelvic brim. And we said that the pelvic brim, of course, the pubis symphysis, the pubic crests, the arcuate line, the pectineal line, the arcuate line, and then of course, the ala of the sacrum are going to help, forming this pelvic brim. Now, so let's look at, now, if you can see here, again, inferiorly, from posterior to anterior, there are some openings which are able to move from the pelvic cavity to the perineum. So we'll look at the perineum later. And so this one, which is the posterior moon structure, becomes, the anal canal. And then of course, you're also going to have, so there's the rectum all the way becoming the anal canal, actually. Then, in the middle portion, we are going to have the vagina. There's a female specimen. And then of course, this is the urethra. So we are going to look at some important aspects as far as, these muscles are concerned. Now, if you take the pelvis actually has two groups of muscles. There are actually 5 muscles which are organized into 2 groups. And these 2 groups are, we have the one which is actually, we call it, the lower limb muscles. There are 2 of these ones, and we have 3 of them forming what we call the pelvic floor, which you are going to see. So the 2 which are forming what we call the lower limb muscles actually help in lateral rotating the hip joint, and you see why it's going to lateral rotate. Now, so one of these muscles is this one, which you can find here, actually taking, so these ones that you see here, so coming, these are the fibers coming actually from, the anterior portion of the lower aspect of, the sacrum, this muscle. So coming all the way, it's actually triangular shaped or pear shaped. So coming all the way and actually leaving through what we call the greater sciatic foramen, leaving the pelvis, and then of course coming to insert a tendon, inserting in actually the superior aspect of the greater trochanter, That muscle is known as piriformis muscle. Now, this piriformis muscle is very important. Yes, why? So that it can help us, so that these neurovascular structures which are exiting, from the pelvis actually into the perineal area, we can, into the gluteal area, we can actually know. So this muscle, which is superior to this piriformis muscle, is known as superior gluteal artery. Yes, its nerve will also accompany it, and then below it, we also have what we call the inferior gluteal, nerves and vessels also being around here. So the inferior portion will present with the inferior gluteal nerves and vessels, and then superiorly, we are also going to have, the superior gluteal nerves and vessels. All right, so that's the piriformis muscle. Yes, because the greater trochanter is more or less, laterally, position, and therefore, if this muscle is going to insert there, then it's going to help rotate, the hip joint laterally, more or less like rotating it away, moving it away from the great toe. Now, the next muscle, which we find, actually finds attachment from what we call, the superior portion of the, superior pubic ramus, inferior portion of the superior pubic ramus, and then, the internal aspect of this membrane known as the obturator membrane. And that muscle, because it's taking origin from the inner aspect of the obturator membrane, we call this muscle the obturator internus muscle. Now, this obturator internus muscle, will also leave, and come out through, this time around, through the lesser sciatic foramen, and goes all the way, through the greater sciatic foramen again, and then goes all the way to insert, lesser sciatic foramen. This is the greater sciatic foramen, and then we have this being the lesser sciatic foramen. So through the lesser sciatic foramen to insert on the superior portion of the greater trochanter of the femur. So similarly, it's also going to help in lateral rotation of the hip joint, But of course, in addition to these ones, it's also going to help, stabilize, the head of the femur in the acetabulum, All right. Now, this obturator internus muscle will actually present with a fascia. So its thickness, it has obturator fascia, which actually thickens forming this, fascial, sling-like, this fascial, membrane over here, which actually takes attachment from the posterior aspect of the body of the ilium all the way to what we call the ischial spine. This is what we call arcus tendinous or tendinous arch. And this tendinous arch will give attachment to this, muscle, which we call it, the levator ani muscle, which we'll get to see. So this is arcus tendinous, thickening of the obturator fascia. Now, if I turn it this way posteriorly, this same thickening around the ischiopubic rami area, it also gives a split. So internally, at the lower portion, internally of the ischiopubic ramus, it thickens also. This area is known as Alcock's canal, Alcock's canal. So that is split to allow what we call the pudendal, or this area is also known as pudendal canal. Alcock's canal is also known as pudendal canal, allowing for the passage of these vessels into the perineal area. So this is the internal pudendal, nerve, and of course the nerve is the white one, and then the vessel, artery actually. So these ones are there. Now, the next, muscle that we want to see, will be what we call the levator ani muscle. Now, in quadriceps, such as the goat, the dog, what happens is that they're able to utilize this, muscle very well, by using it to wag their tail. Of course, in human beings, we don't have tail, therefore, this muscle, wouldn't perform that function. Now, importantly, what this muscle is going to do is that it's going to help in formation of the pelvic floor, So by so doing, by forming, this pelvic floor, then it's also able to help, give support to major organs of the pelvis. All right, so it means that when this pelvic floor, which we are going to look at, becomes weak, then of course those important structures may get prolapsed. Of course, something like the rectum, the uterus, they get prolapsed, and it will actually lead to something we call, incontinence. In situation, for instance, if you could lead to fecal incontinence, because at the end of the day, you look at some modifications of these pelvic floor muscles, which are able to form some sphincters to help hold the content in these, cavities or in these important structures. Now, the first one that we want to talk about, this muscle, which is actually here, all the way. So as you can see, so look at where my pen is running, all the way to here. This muscle is known as levator ani muscle. Levator ani muscle. This levator ani muscle actually presents with two parts. We have the part which is more closer to these three structures over here, which we said that's the the rectum and anal canal. Of course, the vagina, and of course the urethra anteriorly. Then the one which is more closer to them is known as pubococcygeus muscle. Pubococcygeus muscle. Remember that these levator ani muscles will actually take attachment from the arcus tendinous or the tendinous arch, and actually come all the way to have attachment to what we call the sacrum, and of course the coccyx. Sacrum and then the coccyx. So this is the levator ani. The more medial one, closer to these structures, is known as pubococcygeus muscle. Pubococcygeus muscle. Now, this pubococcygeus muscle, sometimes it can become weak, and therefore there will be the need to exercise it. So, as if the content is coming out, or as if you are urinating and you want to stop it, then that's how you are able to help, exercise this muscle, which, otherwise we call it, Kegel exercise, named after the person who discovered it, Kegel. So once you exercise it, then you tend to give strength to this muscle, So by so doing, you are going to help, reduce what we call stress incontinence, either fecal or, urinary incontinence. Now, again, what happens is that, there is another one, which is a bit farther away, lateral to pubococcygeus, and that one is known as iliococcygeus muscle. Iliococcygeus muscle. So from tendinous arch all the way to you have a common, origin and insertion, iliococcygeus muscle. So which is also part of this, levator ani muscle. Now we tend to see that there are modifications of the one which is very close to these three structures, and those modifications are actually coming from the one which is very close to them, and that's the pubococcygeus muscle. So the pubococcygeus muscle could be modified, so it forms a sling around the rectum, so that it performs some kind of sphincteric role. So that for you to actually defecate, you have to relieve the sphincteric rule by this modification, by actually squatting to aid in defecation. So this muscle is known as puborectalis. Puborectalis. It's actually a modification of the pubococcygeus muscle, very close to it, puborectalis muscle. Now the next one, which is very close, which also forms a sling around this vagina, will be called sphincter vaginae. Sphincter vaginae. Well, in males, you have the prostate, we call it, sphincter, prostati. Or you can also call this one, pubovaginalis. Pubovaginalis. You have puborectalis, pubovaginalis, or sphincter vaginae. Then you also have what we call another one over here, which will surround the urethra, okay, which we will call it pubourethralis. Pubourethralis. So puborectalis, pubovaginalis, pubourethralis. So these are modifications of the pubococcygeus muscle. So what they are going to do is to help hold the content. Now this pelvic floor, or these muscles which are forming diaphragm of the pelvis, will be completed by another one which is a bit posterior, okay, taking attachment actually from the ischium, and the sacrum and the coccyx. We call it coccygeus muscle. But because it's having attachment to the ischium, we want to even sometimes qualify it using the word ischio-coccygeus muscle. Ischio-coccygeus muscle. So this is also triangular shape. This is the ischio-coccygeus muscle, as you can see. So on top of the the levator ani muscles, we are going to have what we call ischio-coccygeus muscle. All right. Now, so they form, the pelvic floor. So these are the muscles which are going to help, form the pelvic floor. Now, in our later on, we'll look at some muscles which are very important as far as the perineum is concerned. We'll look at the, urogenital diaphragm and all that. Now, right now, I want to look at, the blood vessels which are related to this, pelvis. Blood vessels which are related to this pelvis. So remember that, the pelvis will mainly be supplied by what we call internal iliac artery, branches of the internal iliac artery. So of course, we are going to see most of them here. Now at the level of what we call, L4, the lumbar vertebra 4, a bit superior to this one, then what we call the abdominal aorta will divide, will bifurcate, so that it gives us what we call two, left and right, common iliac arteries. And, at the level where, we have what we call the sacroiliac, junction, then they tend to also bifurcate. Okay, they tend to bifurcate, giving us what we call the external iliac artery, which will continue, go below what we call the inguinal ligament to continue as the femoral artery to supply, the lower limb. Then this one will go internally to become what we call the internal iliac artery. And this internal iliac artery will give supply to, the pelvis, its wall, and of course its viscera. So remember that, yes, apart from this, internal iliac artery, yes, even we have what we call the median sacral artery, which of course are the bifurcation of the, common iliacs. at the bifurcation of the abdominal aorta into common iliacs, at its middle portion you get this blood vessel. You get this blood vessel that you can see running almost in the midline. This is the median sacral artery. Yes, even apart from this, yes, of course, sometimes you have the superior rectal artery, which you can see here. But these are the major muscles which are going to supply the pelvis. Now let's look at the internal iliac artery, which is of importance to us. This internal iliac artery will actually divide. So this is the internal iliac artery. It will give off actually two main divisions. It will give off what we call an anterior division over here. So this is where it is dividing. It will give off an anterior division, and then of course it will give off also a posterior division. Now the posterior division is going to exclusively supply the wall of this pelvic cavity. So you have one which will actually ascend upwards, and that's what we call the iliolumbar artery. Iliolumbar artery will ascend upwards, and therefore of course it will supply the ilium as well as the lumbar portion. Then of course there will be another one which actually descends parallel to what we call the median sacral artery. So this one will be the lateral sacral artery. And actually the next branch will be this one, which we call it superior gluteal artery. So as you can see, we are going to have these main branches, what we call iliolumbar artery. We are going to have what we call the lateral sacral artery, yes, on either side. Then we're also going to have the superior gluteal artery. Remember that superior gluteal artery is actually the largest branch of the internal iliac artery. So these are the divisions of the posterior division. These are the branches of the posterior division. Actually, they are parietal in nature, supplying these muscles which form the wall of the pelvis. Now the next one that we find is the anterior division. Now the anterior division will give off this branch over here, which we can see running a white structure, and this is obturator artery, and this is the obturator nerve. So the white one, which is superior to obturator artery, so they run together and they go through this superior portion, which we call it obturator canal, to actually come out. So this is all the obturator vessels. Actually the nerve is also supposed to be part of it. So this is what we have. Now the next one that we find, yes, will be this one, which we call it the umbilical artery. And this umbilical artery will actually will give rise, also divide into what we call the superior vesicle, give rise to superior vesicle, and of course will terminate in old age. In life, what will happen is that it becomes remnant, which we call it medial umbilical ligament, forming the medial umbilical ligament actually. So that's what we are going to have. And then yes, this one, which also pierces in here, is what we call the inferior gluteal artery, so which will also come out through what we call the greater sciatic foramen over here, inferior gluteal artery. And then you also have this one, which will actually enter in here. So this is known as what we call internal pudendal artery. Internal pudendal artery is over here. And then over here, yes, this one, we are going to have what we call the inferior vesical artery, supplying actually the lower part of the urinary bladder, inferior vesical artery. So that's what we are going to find actually here. But there are other branches of it. Now these ones are mainly for the wall. Now we have also what we call the visceral branches, which are not really shown here. apart from the umbilical artery, we're also going to have what we call the uterine artery. Yes, even the middle rectal artery. Yes, apart from that, even the vaginal artery, in females. And then of course, because in males you are not going to have what we call uterine artery. Sometimes you are going to have the inferior vesical artery, in males. So that is what we are going to find around here. Now, remember that yes, this one that you see, actually the anterior rama of S2, S3, S4, actually converge and become what we call the pudendal nerve, and it will exit, in here. So you have a pudendal nerve around, but this is not pudendal nerve. This is actually sciatic nerve. You look at it when you look at the gluteal region. Look at this is the sciatic nerve, which is always in constant relation with what we call the posterior cutaneous nerve of thigh and its medial part. So that is what we are going to find. So essentially, but remember that this one which crosses it is actually the gonadal vessel, so that in males we call it the testicular, and in females we call it the ovarian vessels. Now remember that actually the nerves that supply the pelvis will be coming from the lumbar plexus, and as well as actually the obturator nerve, as well as the sacral plexus. So we look at all those nerve supply in a later section. But remember that most of the viscera over here, which will include the urinary bladder, even the rectum and all that, will actually receive innervation from actually the pudendal nerve. Yes, they will supply with what we call sensory innervation to the pudendal nerve. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your audience. I hope this is going to be helpful to you, as well as far as studying the muscles of the pelvis. Just organize them into those of the lower limb and those that form the pelvic floor. Thank you very much once again.